The biting wind of late autumn swept across the desolate landscape of Northern California, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and coming rain. The Sierra Nevada mountains stood like silent sentinels, their peaks dusted with the first snow of the season. Below them, nestled in a deep valley, lay the town of Red Creek, a small community built on a foundation of logging and hard work. Looming over everything was the immense concrete wall of the Red Creek Dam, a structure that had been a source of both pride and worry for generations. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit control room of the dam, Mark, a cocky young engineer from the city, ran his fingers over the cool steel console. He was meticulously reviewing pressure readings, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the utilitarian surroundings. Mark saw himself as the future, a brilliant mind brought in to modernize a place he considered primitive. He glanced up as a man entered the room, pushing a heavy cleaning cart. The man, Frank, was older, with deep lines etched around his eyes and calloused hands that told a story of a life spent in physical labor. Frank had been the dam's janitor for 20 years, but he saw his job as more of a caretaker. He knew every bolt, every crevice, every unique sound the massive structure made. "Make sure you don't get your mop water on the schematics, old-timer," Mark said with a smirk, not even bothering to make eye contact. Frank paused, a quiet dignity in his posture. "I've been cleaning this room longer than you've been alive, son. I know where everything is." Mark chuckled dismissively. "Sure, but do you understand what any of this means?" He gestured to a complex diagram on the monitor, a detailed cross-section of the dam's internal structure. "See this? These are the primary stress points. I've run the models. They're all within acceptable parameters. No need for alarm." As Mark spoke, Frank's gaze wasn't on the screen, but on a faint, almost invisible hairline crack in the concrete floor near the main access tunnel. He had noticed it a few days ago. Now, a minuscule trickle of water seeped from it. "Mark," Frank said, his voice low and serious, "there's a leak by the tunnel entrance." Mark scoffed. "A leak? Probably just condensation." "It's an old dam. Things get damp." Frank didn't move. "This feels different. The air pressure in that tunnel has been off all morning. I heard a low hum a few hours ago. It's not right." Mark finally turned, an exasperated look on his face. "Are you serious? You're a janitor. I'm a structural engineer. I've been studying this damned schematics for weeks. Everything is fine." Just as the words left his mouth, a piercing, shrill tone filled the control room. The main alarm, a sound that hadn't been heard in decades, blared through the speakers. A red warning light flashed on the console, illuminating a section of the diagram that represented the primary stress points. The readings had just skyrocketed, moving from within acceptable parameters to critical failure. Mark's face went white with shock. The floor beneath their feet began to tremble, and a deep, groaning sound, the sound of stressed concrete, echoed from deep within the dam's core. Water began to pour from the crack Frank had pointed out, a torrent now, not a trickle. The sirens outside started blaring, a desperate warning to the town below. The dam, a symbol of stability, was on the verge of collapse. Mark's arrogant confidence vanished, replaced by a cold, paralyzing fear. He looked at Frank, the man he had just mocked, and saw not a janitor, but the only person who truly understood the heartbeat of this dying structure. Panic seized Mark as the control room began to shake violently. The console lights flickered, and a cascade of sparks rained down from a damaged power conduit. Frank, however, remained calm. He was already moving, grabbing a radio from the wall and barking orders into it. His voice was steady, authoritative, the voice of a man who had prepared for this moment his entire life. "Main floodgates are failing, I repeat. Main floodgates are failing. Evacuate Red Creek now. Everyone, get to high ground." Mark stood frozen, the reality of the situation crashing over him. The models he had so proudly presented were wrong. He had been so focused on the data, he had missed the truth, the tangible physical reality that Frank had seen and felt. "We have to go," Frank shouted, grabbing Mark's arm. "The lower tunnels are the only way out, and they'll be flooded within minutes." They scrambled out of the control room and into the cold, damp concrete corridors of the dam. The air was thick with the dust of crumbling concrete and the roar of rushing water. Mark's mind, trained to deal with numbers and figures, couldn't keep up with the chaos. It was Frank, moving with practiced speed and knowledge, who led the way. "This way! It's the service tunnel," Frank yelled, pushing open a heavy steel door that groaned in protest. "My wife is on her way out of town. She should be safe, but we have to make sure no one else is trapped." They descended a metal ladder into the darkness. Water was already pooling at the bottom, a cold, murky tide. The air was heavy with the pressure of the reservoir above them. As they navigated the narrow tunnels, Frank pointed out small, intricate details. A loose bolt here, a hairline fracture there, all the small warnings he had been observing for years, warnings Mark had dismissed. "You knew," Mark said, the words barely a whisper. "You knew this was coming." Frank didn't answer, his face a grim mask of concentration. They had to get to the main valve control room to try and manually slow the flow of water, to buy the town more time for a full evacuation. As they moved deeper, they came to a point where a section of the tunnel was completely blocked by a concrete collapse. A massive steel girder lay twisted and bent across their path. "We can't get through," Mark said, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Frank, however, wasn't giving up. He studied the wreckage, his eyes scanning for a solution. He noticed a small, ajar maintenance hatch near the ceiling, barely big enough for a person to squeeze through. "I can fit," Frank said, a plan forming in his mind. "I can go through and try to reach the manual controls from the other side. You'll need to go back and get to the communications center to relay a message to the town. Tell them to head to the old schoolhouse. It's the highest point in town." Mark, for the first time, felt a surge of respect for the older man. He saw the janitor's courage, his selflessness. Frank was ready to risk his life for the people of Red Creek, but Mark knew he couldn't let him go alone. "No," Mark said, grabbing a piece of rebar from the debris. "I'm coming with you. I'm not a janitor and I'm not a hero, but I'm an engineer, and it's my job to fix this. Let's get to work." Working together, they managed to pry open the hatch. Frank, with his wiry frame, squeezed through first, his body contorting with surprising agility. Mark followed, his larger frame struggling against the tight space. Once on the other side, they found themselves in a narrow, vertical service shaft. The air was thick with mist, and the roaring of the water was deafening. They climbed down the rusty ladder, their hands raw and their muscles burning. The manual valve control room was at the very bottom, submerged in a foot of rushing water. They waded through the icy current, the force of the water pushing against them. Inside the small, claustrophobic room, a series of giant, corroded wheels controlled the emergency valves. Frank went to the first one, placing his hands on the cold metal. "This one controls the auxiliary gate. If we can get this closed, it'll slow the flow enough for the last people to get out." The wheel was stuck fast. Years of disuse and rust had fused it to its base. They both tried to turn it, straining every muscle, but it wouldn't budge. Mark, his mind racing, remembered a detail from the schematics. The wheel's lock mechanism was a complex hydraulic system. "It's hydraulic. There's a manual bypass switch on the back of the panel. We need a lever." Frank's eyes scanned the room and landed on a heavy iron pry bar leaning against the wall. That might work. They used the bar to force the switch, and with a hiss of escaping pressure, the wheel finally turned, its gears grinding. They worked together, a synchronized effort of strength and determination. As the gate slowly began to close, the roar of the water outside lessened slightly, a small victory in a losing battle. But their relief was short-lived. A new, more powerful alarm sounded. The main power grid to the dam was failing. The town, now fully evacuating, would lose all light and communication. They needed a way to signal that they had slowed the flow. "My old radio!" Frank shouted, pointing to a small battery-operated radio receiver on a shelf. "It's not powerful enough to send a signal, but we can use the emergency beacon." The beacon, however, was in a sealed, waterproof case that had been bolted shut. Mark, his hands trembling with cold and exhaustion, grabbed a wrench. "I can get this open, but it'll take time." As he worked, a section of the ceiling above them gave way. A torrent of cold water and debris crashed into the room, sending them sprawling. Mark was pinned under a heavy concrete slab. His leg was trapped, and a sharp, searing pain shot up his spine. Frank, bruised and battered, struggled to his feet. He saw Mark's terrified eyes and the water rising rapidly around them. He knew he couldn't lift the slab alone. "Mark, listen to me," Frank said, his voice calm but firm. "I need you to tell me what to do. I can't lift this, but I can get the beacon. We have to finish what we started." Mark, his face pale with pain, looked at the pry bar. "Frank, use that. Wedge it under the slab, give me enough room to breathe, then get the beacon. We need to signal the town. Now!" Frank, with newfound resolve, grabbed the pry bar and, with a monumental effort, wedged it under the concrete. It was enough to give Mark a small pocket of air. The older man then turned to the beacon, his hands fumbling, his fingers a blur of motion as he worked to pry it open. He knew the importance of the signal. It wasn't just about slowing the water. It was about giving a final, desperate message to a town he loved. As the beacon's light began to flash a steady, rhythmic pulse into the darkness, Frank looked back at Mark, who was gasping for air. A new surge of water rushed in, bringing with it the final deafening roar of the dam's collapse. The last thing Frank saw was Mark's face, no longer arrogant or dismissive, but filled with a shared sense of purpose and a profound, silent respect. They were no longer the engineer and the janitor. They were two men, bound by a disaster they had faced together, fighting to the end to save a community that now knew a different kind of heroism.